right, thank you.
Good morning. I'd like to call this meeting to order. Welcome to the January 8th, 2025 Public Safety and Justice Subcommittee. I'd like to introduce City Attorney Jennifer Vega. Ms. Vega, please explain the role of public comment.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and committee members. During citizen comment, members of the public may address the subcommittee for up to 3 minutes on issues of interest or concern to them. The Arizona Open Meetings Law permits the subcommittee members to listen to comments, but prohibits members from discussing or acting on the matters presented. Members of the public may speak for up to 2 minutes to comment on agenda items to be discussed. Comments must be related to the agenda item and the action being considered by the subcommittee. The City Council and staff cannot discuss or comment on matters related to pending investigations, claims, or litigation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Vega. I would also like to introduce our interpreter, Elsie Duarte, who will provide a brief announcement. Elsie?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone. My name is Elsie Duarte. I will be servicing as Spanish interpreter for today's Public Safety and Justice Subcommittee session. I will now take a moment to introduce myself to our Spanish-speaking audience and review some guidelines. Buenos días, bienvenidos a la sesión de la Subcomisión de Seguridad Pública y Justicia. Mi nombre es Elsie Duarte y estaré sirviéndoles como intérprete a nuestra audiencia de habla hispana. Deseamos pedirles antemano, si va a dar un comentario público, por favor hable despacio, con claridad y evite tener distracciones de fondo. Finalmente, pause después de cada una o dos oraciones para poder interpretar lo que esté diciendo de la manera más completa posible. Gracias. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Okay, we start this subcommittee meeting with a call to the public, and we do have, I believe, 4 registered speakers. We will start with Tony Harris.
Good morning. I'm Tony Harris for Fund for Empowerment. There's this makeshift swap meet I go to a couple times a month on 21st Street in Roosevelt, and it stretches over to Fillmore. And there's like a makeshift swap meet out there. There's all Hispanics that they're selling products. And the last time I went, instead of there being like 40 or 50 people out there, right there on the sidewalk, they have a table set up and everything, there was only a couple of them. And when I asked, well, where'd everyone go? She said that the local cops, PPD, came, and after one of the neighbors called complaining that there were people in the alleys using the bathroom and doing drugs or whatever, that they came up to those people at the swap meet and threatened them with citations and locking them up. And most of those people that I knew over there are here without documents, so they got scared that they were going to be deported. And I thought that other jurisdictions were going to be assisting Border Patrol and doing any type of detainment of Hispanics if they're here without documents. I didn't think that PPD would be threatening them like that, because I know a couple of years ago at McDonald's over here on 7th and Van Buren, there was the manager called the cops on people that were in the dining room for too long. And when the cops got there, if you were not a customer, a cop was coming up to people telling them if they didn't leave, they were going to go to jail. So, and with regard to the swap meet on 21st Street in Roosevelt, if you go up to Roosevelt Row a couple miles west, and no one ever tells them that they have to go or run. They've never gotten ran off, and they've been there for years, maybe last 5 years or so. selling products. But at the one on 21st Street in Roosevelt, they've been there for like 20 years. So, thank you, City Council.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Next, Elizabeth Venable.
Okay. Know your new public comment. Anyway, so we like to go gather a lot of data. And by data, I mean we talk to, perhaps hundreds of people and up to thousands of people over many years about their experiences with law enforcement that are on the streets. And I found it very interesting. I talked to a few people that were near a service provider, a mental health service provider, and they told me about a City of Phoenix employee. They did not know the program, but they received a flyer that had the symbol for the City of Phoenix on it about having belongings discarded. They did not receive this flyer until they demanded that flyer and proof, but everybody else's stuff was rounded up and thrown away, right, as per is not supposed to happen under the injunction Fund for Empowerment v. City of Phoenix. However, the interesting part that I found was that that person who was representing the City of Phoenix told those individuals specifically to go on other people's private property and camp there because they said, where are we supposed to go? They did not offer them shelter. They did not offer them detox, nothing. They just said, go on private property. Is this the kind of behavior that the City of Phoenix is doing to encourage people, essentially forcing them to commit crimes because they can't be on public property and there are no access to services? You and I know these services are completely full because of demand. It is almost impossible to get in these services unless you are arrested or are maybe going through detox, maybe, right? Or possibly entering into the SMI system. But it's very difficult to get in these services unless you're going through the police department, especially where they're not open campuses. So I just think, I know you have a lot of pressure from the state of Arizona. You don't want to have to pay out those private landowners for the cost of not enforcing the laws. But if you're just telling them to go on private property, what is the greater crime in America, right? It's supposed to be all about private property, but, there is no place to go. And so this is what your staff are telling people. I just thought I'd make you aware of that you're essentially instructing people to commit crimes so that you guys don't pay out.
Thank you, Ms. Venable. The next speaker is Orla Bobo.
My name is Orla Bobo. I'm here today not only as a resident of District 2, but also as a Phoenician. Over the past 2 years, during my public records request, I've learned that our fire department and safety departments are severely underfunded by our city. Long response times have been an issue for years, so it can no longer be referred to as a crisis. People have died, people's quality of life has changed. I've had members of the community reach out to me who have lost their members due to this, quote, crisis. The men and women that we count on to show up in our time of need don't have the resources they need to do their job and to do their job safely. I've met with City Manager, Mr. Barton, I've met with Councilman Waring, and I've met with Chief Duran in regards to emergency funding or diverting funds. Their response was that we could possibly rely on a later go bond or an increased tax rate or outside city fire departments to lend aid. However, years of doing this has never solved the problem. The City of Phoenix is planning a $50 million project known as Shade Phoenix, which will plant trees and shade structures. However, they're not willing to put the money into protecting our citizens and first responders. The citizens of Phoenix would agree that public safety should be the #1 focus of our mayor, city manager, and city council. The city's measurement of whether the public safety system is working properly is strictly response times, which you are failing. Taxpaying citizens, their families, and loved ones deserve better. First responders, both fire and police, deserve better. How many more people have to die? How many more lawsuits will the city of Phoenix take to stand up for the community? All I've seen is complacency. I believe this is criminal negligence. And I think that the city of Phoenix needs a shift in its moral compass. It will be 2 years in February that I started advocating for my fellow citizens and first responders. I expect change, and I will not back down until our city and our people are taken care of. I want to know what immediate action will be taken and how the citizens can be included in this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bobo. I misspoke earlier where I said we had 4 speakers. We actually have 3 on public comment, have another speaker for a different item, so we'll come to that in another time, later on. So at this point, item number 1 is approval of the PSJ minutes from December 4th, 2024. Do I have a motion?
Move to approve minutes. Second.
Okay, I have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Chair votes aye, passes. Thank you very much. Our first presentation today is on item number 2, and we'll welcome Communications Director Dan Wilson with Ayal. Ayal, I can't pronounce your last name, so I apologize about that in advance. And from BAR, it's the same thing there from Zen City. We'll welcome them to the table, and I'll allow Dan to introduce them formally or more appropriately, and they'll provide information on this particular issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman Robinson and members of the subcommittee. Today we're here to provide a briefing on Blockwise, which is a product designed by Zen City and used by police departments across the country. With me today is Ayal Halamish, who is the Vice President of Strategic Accounts for Zen City, and Bar Asherov, Zen City's Director of Enterprise and Law Enforcement. They will show how Blockwise may help support the city and answer any questions that you might have. The city has partnered with Zen City for several years, using their software that evaluates publicly available information and social media posts to understand community sentiment and items of discussion for residents, business owners, and visitors. Zen City conducts a quarterly community survey evaluating community characteristics and overall satisfaction of residents in Phoenix. The results of the survey help staff better understand strengths and weaknesses that have led to key initiatives, including the creation of the first ever 602 Day. I'll now turn it over to Bar to talk specifically about Blockwise.
Thanks, Dan. Chairman Robinson, members of the subcommittee. Zen City's Blockwise platform is a purpose-built tool to help law enforcement agencies hear from everybody in their community. We've deployed across lots of major city agencies in the US, from LAPD, Chicago. And the way that the technology works is it's essentially a survey that's distributed equitably throughout the community and reaches over 90% of residents through digital advertising. By leveraging these avenues, we can actually reach more people in more places and make sure that we're hearing more voices. That is fed into a dashboard, which then the police department can leverage to understand what the community's priorities are. And the way it works is that the survey takes 2 minutes to complete or less. It lowers the barrier to participation by defaulting to the language of the device of the user. It's weighted on a monthly basis, which means that the police department will have the data live and be able to measure on an ongoing basis any actions or initiatives that they take. This is an example of what the ad looks like. The resident will answer a few questions that will then be fed into the dashboard. These are a couple of examples. The dashboard then breaks it down by the precincts of the police department. And as you can see, we're using LA as an example here to measure the perception of trust, safety, transparency, and other metrics. We can then drill down around the data into specific scores broken down by specific demographics and specific topics, which then allows us to really measure and understand what are the pervasive issues that are facing a specific precinct or area versus a blip on the radar, if you will. One of the most valuable pieces of it is that we can actually collect open-ended feedback so that we can get context around some of the answers that we're getting, allowing us to really measure what is top of mind from the community. And if we think about it from a practical sense, it means that we're getting the information that folks typically don't call 911 about, for example, so that we can gauge on an ongoing basis what are other things that are happening. You can see a few examples here: streets and traffic, theft, burglary, and break-ins, police responses. And that allows a police department to then not only engage with the community, but also measure whatever the engagement is and the initiatives are on an ongoing basis. I'll pass it on to Eyal to talk a little bit about how we deploy that with LAPD.
Chairman and members of the subcommittee, just a brief example. Los Angeles Police Department every month gets a representative sample of Angelinos that are providing them insight as to how safe they feel and their perception of trust of the police department. They operationalize this data by involving it in their CompStat meetings. So every 2 weeks, a deputy chief and command staff are asked to report on how they're performing, not just on their crime numbers, but also on the perception of safety and trust numbers as well. And so that means that the data is reported on, it's operationalized from the command staff level through to the captain level. Decisions are being made on a every 2-week basis based on this rolling point of information. And today we also have former Chief Rahinsky, who's pivotal in implementing this type of technology inside police forces, making sure that officers are using this data on a regular basis and using it to actually make decisions in near real time. What does this actually mean for the city of Phoenix and the Phoenix Police Department? It means that every month we'll have a sample where we can measure and report community trust and sense of safety. It means that we'll be able to provide insights for the chief, command staff, city manager, and city council as to how we're performing, not just on people's suggested comments on the side, but with a representative sample that we can rely on. We can also track those trends to drive decision making in the same way that we're looking at crime data. We're seeing police departments across the country now use crime data alongside this data to make those decisions in a much more effective, efficient, and creative way. And finally, we'll be able to evaluate plans and policy proposals such as our canine policy or our youth interactions policy or our data policies using this data as well. So happy to pause there for any questions you might have.
Councilwoman Guardado.
Thank you. So I guess just a question around, you're using LA as an example. When did the program start in Los Angeles?
Yeah, we've been with Los Angeles Police Department for, we've been with the city for a number of years now, but the police department specifically, we've been doing this for the last year and a bit.
And with the results that you guys are getting, what has been the success rate? What has changed within the department since you guys gave that data?
Yeah, it's threefold. So one, the fact that the data is being used by officers and they're fluently speaking to this data shows a cultural shift inside the organization from kind of being hyper reactive to things that emerge in the police force to being far more proactive and leadership focused. But secondly, in some of the specific parts of the LAPD, looking at the data, they've actually seen increases in satisfaction, increases in perception of trust, specifically in the South Bureau region of LA, just by monitoring the data, deploying resources, and communicating about the plans that they put in place.
Thank you.
Councilwoman O'Brien.
Thank you, Chair. You talked about ensuring equitable distribution, but my question is, how do you ensure that you're actually getting responses from those folks?
Thank you for the question, Councilmember. So the way that the technology works is similar to the community survey that the city is already using. Think of it like a drip system. So the ads are constantly being sent out to the community across multitude of avenues, from social media to blogs to wherever you can serve an ad. As a result, on an ongoing basis, we know that we're mirroring the demographics of the city. And so as the month goes by, we have to fill those buckets of demographics. If for some reason, we're short as the month goes by on a certain demographic group, we will just make sure we send more ads to fill that up, which is why we typically actually oversample for our partner cities because of the method that we're using.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, I had just one question, then I'll make a comment about things in general. I know there's always a concern when we have products like this, and obviously we're using it in the rest of the city. Every once in a while, folks will be concerned about them being tracked. And in this day and age, clearly that is an area of concern for folks. So if I'm somebody who would like to provide information or feedback on my interactions with the police, but I'm fearful of the police or any future interactions with them, how does that come into play? Can you help me or help us understand more completely about whether or not there is a tracking mechanism in there at all?
So one of the advantages of it, Chairman, is that it's completely anonymous. The way we send it out is we know anonymously where devices are. Digital networks have that. We don't have any access to that. And so as a result, we are not tracking anything that's personally identifiable to anybody across anything. It's, by the way, one of the reasons it's so easy for us to deploy this technology is that it's simply you scrolling on your social network, anonymously knows that the device is located in Phoenix, and then you have to input a specific zip code, for example, to triage that with the anonymous device of the location. That's the way we make sure that the person's actually in Phoenix. But we don't have any access to any identifiable information. We don't ask for anything identifiable information as well. And that's why, by the way, the barrier to participation is so low, because unlike a typical survey that I'm sure everyone's familiar with, where you do need to fill that information, we don't need any of that in order to get the survey completed.
Okay, thank you for that. Councilwoman Guardado.
Thank you. And just talking about equity, how many languages do you guys do this in?
That depends on the city. So typically any population that's 5% of more of that city or entity, we can reach. So, we've got cities that do it in 7 languages, and we've got cities that do it in 3. It's up to our collaboration when we onboard.
And if you find yourself in that there are certain pockets of a city, you talked a little bit about it, but if you find yourself that you have pockets of a certain city that you just cannot reach those residents, then what happens?
So one of the advantages of this is that because, according to Pew Research, by the way, across any demographic group, between 88, I think, to 92% have a smart device. It allows us to reach everybody versus a traditional survey where, you're sending out a paper mailer and then you're hoping that you're going to get enough responses back. Here, if as the month goes by, we see that, we're missing a certain demographic group, we will just pump more ads, if you will, to make sure that we can fill that. And till this day, we haven't had a problem filling sample.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, if there aren't any more questions, I'll make a general comment about things. One of the things I wanted to do, or I did do, in preparation for this, I did speak at length with the police chief in Albuquerque. We're a little bit larger than Albuquerque, obviously, but the police department has similar issues that the city of Phoenix has gone through. And they're using Zen City and Blockwise, and the information that the police chief and his command staff are able to glean from the application, according to the police chief, has been tremendous. It allows them to make the necessary decisions they need to make with regard to staffing, deployment, just a little bit of everything. So they have been very happy with it. Chief Sullivan and I had an opportunity to talk about it. It's something that he sees as another tool that we can use here in the valley or here in the city that would better enhance our relationship with the community. And obviously that's critical to us as we move forward within the police department. So I just want to make that comment. Are there any other questions from any of the members? Councilwoman Guardado.
Thank you. And how do you guys get this information, right? If you guys were to work with the city of Phoenix, I know that there's a very important relationship that then gets established with the chief. But then how does that information then get to us as council members?
I think that'll actually be a question for me. Council member, we would be the ones to share that. So they provide a report each month, and that report would come as a PDF that we would then forward on to the council offices for review.
Great. I mean, I think it's something, one thing that we've been striving for, at least since, I know for a long time, but at least since I've been on the council that I can speak about, is wanting to build that trust within the community to be able to fill those gaps, given, you know, the issues and the challenges we've had in the last couple of years. I know there's been a huge effort from the chief and from our police force to try to build that gap. And I think if this is a program that will help us continue to fill that gap and for everyone to be able to understand each other and have a program that can speak towards what the police department is doing and being able to build that trust again with the community, I think it's key. I think it's important. But I think for me, it's going to be incredibly important that we try to reach that population that sometimes it's really hard to reach. Not so much because they don't want to speak up, or more because they have 2 or 3 different jobs. And then also making sure that that information does get to us and that we're able to work together with all of you to making sure that the information that we do get is accurate and that we continue to work on having better communication. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, Bar, Ayal, Dan, thank you very much for the present. Oh, I'm sorry. You're finished, were you finished with the presentation? Yeah, that was just the appendix, yeah, okay. Thank you for the presentation. Appreciate the opportunity to enlighten us a little bit further about your product. Thank you. Next, we'll welcome Human Services Director Jacqueline Edwards, Human Services Deputy Director Kevin Mattingly, and Police Assistant Chief Ed DeCastro to the table to provide an overview of the city's 2024 Domestic Violence Fatality Review Team Report.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Robinson and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to review the Domestic Violence Fatality Review Team 2023-2024 report. The Phoenix Domestic Violence Fatality Review Team, or DVFRT, was established in 2006 after the passage of ARS 41-198. The purpose is to identify systems gaps and areas for improvement for governmental agencies and nonprofits responding to domestic violence, near fatality, or fatality cases. Members of the current team include representatives from the Human Services Department, Police Department, Fire Department, the city's prosecutor's office, as well as the Maricopa Association of Governments, the Maricopa County Attorney's Office, the Arizona Department of Economic Security, Arizona State University, Honor Health, La Frontera Impact, and A New Leaf. Representatives from the Human Services Department and Police Department are co-leads of the DVFRT. Now, to provide an overview of why it is so important, the work that the DVFRT does and the reason why the report is created in the first place, the domestic violence statistics in the United States do show that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men will experience sexual violence, physical violence, and or stalking by an intimate partner in their lifetime. Additionally, it is estimated that between 3 to 10 million children nationwide witness abuse between their parents or caregivers each year. I will now pass it to Assistant Chief DeCastro to share the domestic violence statistics that specifically pertain to the city of Phoenix.
Good morning. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and committee members. For the City of Phoenix in 2023, which was our last full report, we had 33,756 domestic violence calls for services. Of those, 8,533 people were arrested that year, and of those, just over 2,700 calls for service involved aggravated assault. There were other calls, but that was the biggest majority. Next, thank you. So as you can see, the majority of the violence is classified as physical force, with the other weapons being specifically annotated. The other portion includes anything that is not noted there as a weapon. So it could be a bat, a phone, a lamp, something like that. But physical force using hands, feet, fists, and strangulation is included in all that, in that number. And now I will pass it over to Kevin Mattingly.
Good morning. Excuse me. Good morning, Chairman Robinson, members of the committee. As stated, the Domestic Violence Fatality Review Team is established on the authority of ARS 41198, which describes how the team is constructed and the nature of the case that might be reviewed. For DVFRTs, we review cases that are resulted in a fatal injury or a near fatal event that occurred in the city of Phoenix, which has been fully adjudicated. For the 2024 case, we selected a near fatality incident involving a married heterosexual couple with children. The case had been fully adjudicated, and the victim and a witness were available for interview. And because the assault was witnessed, we felt this case would provide at least two perspectives on the events that led to the assault and then how the assault occurred as on the evening in question. So the couple in question were married in 2019. They moved to Phoenix in 2020. And to that point in their relationship, there had been no history of domestic violence. But in 2021, Phoenix police had 5 contacts with the suspect in that year alone. In those 5 contacts, the suspect was arrested 4 times, and on the 5th time was petitioned for psychiatric evaluation. One of his charges was adjudicated in the Veterans Court. On the night in question, the assault involved a knife, strangulation, and near drowning in the family pool. Again, the DVFRT function is to examine a case and make recommendations for system improvements. And in this case, we arrived at 6 recommendations. The first recommendation was to establish protocols for the crisis response team's response to DV calls. And this fell under the purview of the police and the fire department. This recommendation was formed because the team realized by examining the documents related to the case that a CR team had been requested to this scene. But before they arrived, they were canceled. And the team felt that the opportunity was missed to have the specific and unique skills of the CR team being applied to this crime scene, where again, we had a victim, we had an adult witness, and we had minor children in the home. We felt that the police department and the fire department might collaborate to establish protocols, not just for CR team response, but those criteria that might lead to cancellation of that response, and for follow-up at a later time in order to close that circle. This recommendation has been well received by the police and the fire departments, who are both represented on the team, and they expect to have procedures established by June of this year.
Excuse me, Kevin, real quick question as you go through this. Who canceled, or why was the CRT team canceled?
Chairman Robinson, members of the committee, that's not clear in any of the reports. The cancellation was logged, but not the reason for the cancellation. The speculation was that because of the time of night, it's actually very early morning, and the length of travel that for CR to arrive, along with the medical evaluation and other moving parts, that wait for the CR team to arrive was not the appropriate course of action. And so they canceled and they went ahead with the other medical evaluations and the victim's transportation to the Family Advocacy Center. You're welcome. The second recommendation was to examine policies for the crisis response team response and to consider aligning those protocols with that of the behavioral health teams, which, as you know, are newly formed. This, the primary difference between a BHT and the CR response is the presence of police. CR teams want the police on scene. They've had instances where they've been on scene and the suspect has returned, and they have very valid reasons for those protocols. In fact, the mobile victim advocates associated with the Family Advocacy Center operate similarly, where our advocates stay on a scene that's secured, but when the police leave, they leave. And so we've asked the police and fire departments to look at these protocols in order to come to some semblance of balance between the two. Granted that a BHT scene and a domestic violence scene are very different, and they have significantly different threats associated with being on those scenes.
Chairman, I have a question. So I guess this is more a question for Lori. Lori, so I know that one of the things that, and I'm sure we're gonna talk about it a little bit later, is just response times, just in general in the fire department. We're trying to get better at the response times. Right now, what is the wait time, or what are we thinking and saying, what is the response? By when does the CRT team need to arrive on scene?
So, Mr. Chair, members of the subcommittee, I think if you don't mind me suggesting this, I would suggest that we pause that question for the next presentation, and we can have a discussion about the crisis response units that are part of the CAP program and when they are expected to arrive on scene. It's a little different than the response times we've been discussing related to the fire department as a whole, but we can still have that discussion, but I think it would be probably better in the context of the CAP presentation, which is the next agenda item, if that's okay with you.
That's okay. I just think we just need to talk about that, just because I am a little curious on how this other call got canceled. And I can also see, you know, I mean, there's a moment where someone can finally pick up the phone and call for help. But depending how long it takes us to get there, then, you know, people can sometimes decide that they just don't want to continue and press charges. So I think that's going to be a key component to all of this that we are doing and that we're trying to do around domestic violence. And I think both times are incredibly important. I think they're both crucial in terms of being able to save someone, whether it's their life or whether it's from a really bad situation. So I just think that's important to really talk about it. What is it that as a city we're going to do to making sure that we fill in those gaps on response times? But I still think that this is all a really good idea. Thank you.
Chairman Robinson, members of the committee, the status update on recommendation 2 is similar. The police and fire departments, in this case primarily the fire department, expects to have a revision or response that's appropriate by June of 2025. The third recommendation, as you can see, is addresses the providers of forensic medical examinations. These are contracted providers who provide these services at the Family Advocacy Center. And the recommendation was to consider developing a policy to require medical follow-up in the days and weeks following an examination. In this case, again, we noticed that the victim was ultimately transported to a hospital where she underwent several examinations. Her lack of a primary care physician was identified as a critical point in a person's willingness and ability to have a follow-up exam. And so we felt that it was important that the provider consider the medical appropriateness of such a process. We are very pleased to learn that as we reached out to the provider to suggest this, that they were a step ahead of us and were already considering a program to do precisely that. And so we know they're still working on that at this point, but it's a pleasant surprise to see that we weren't the only ones to come to that conclusion. Recommendation number 4 was to address in-service training for emergency medical personnel, EMTs and paramedics, on recognizing, responding to, and treating cases of impeded breathing, including strangulation. Again, in this case, the victim was assaulted and strangled and then nearly drowned in the family swimming pool. We are aware that EMTs, paramedics undergo this sort of training as a part of their certification, and that the fire department's routine assessment on scene includes breathing, assessment of the person's ability to breathe. The update on this is that the fire department's protocols that are in place now address the assessment of patients for impeded breathing, and they continue to conduct in-service training to address this area. Number 5 was about data collection, and it came to our attention pretty quickly that neither the police nor the Human Services Department, which is my department, tracks strangulation cases separately from other cases. This is because, as you saw in the police statistics earlier, strangulation is included in physical force. And in the human services side, frankly, it just never came to our attention before that that was a significant data point until we started doing research on strangulation and domestic violence. So the police department is reviewing this recommendation and is expected to respond by June of 2025. In the Human Services Department, Victim Services had completed this change to our data collection program in December of last year. And our final recommendation was to change case management protocols for fatal and near-fatal domestic violence incidents. And this, of course, is the Human Services Department's assignment. Understanding the unique and long-lasting effects of a fatal or near-fatal domestic violence incident led the Victim Services Division to examine our practices, which balance what a client is willing to talk about and ready to talk about and ready to take action on with the path we feel they should be on or that we might direct them towards. In the industry, we say that we meet the client where they are, and when folks aren't ready for something, well, you're fighting an uphill battle at that point. And so the result of that is sometimes a case is closed and then it's not followed up on. As a result of that, we have amended our protocols to follow up on fatal or near fatal cases on a scheduled basis. And so part of our new case management system that we're working on, we hope to include a clock that essentially will send reminders at a 3-month, at a 6-month interval to encourage follow-up with our clients in the months after their victimization. And finally, you should know that the 2024-25 DVFRT team is currently being formed and will be producing another report. And part of that report process is to follow up and close the loop on all the recommendations from the previous year's report. So with that, we're welcome to take your questions.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll go to Councilman Waring.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So appreciate your recommendations. I think the major recommendation would be if you've been arrested 4 times and caught a psych eval on the 5th, maybe you should be in jail somewhere. Okay, so I mean, at some point, that is something that people watching at home who are regular citizens might go, what the hell? So I know we've lost our way completely, and you can probably sense my frustration because I live here too. But I have to say, at some point, the whole narrative that the community doesn't like police, that ain't so. So now we don't have enough police to respond to the calls, so we're slow in getting there. So terrible things happen to these victims. But then when we do bring a case, apparently they had enough reason to arrest them 4 different times. We can't make it stick. I mean, I know other states, no bail, second-degree murder, whatever insane things they're doing, doesn't mean we have to follow along. But there was a narrative, which seems to have dropped off in the last couple of years, of maybe we should just let all the prisoners go. That's a fantastic idea. Some Republicans on the national level actually went along with it. Reduce sentences, whatever. That is just idiocy. And so toughening the penalties, I worked on this issue a lot when I was in the state Senate on domestic violence. And that's, I'm sure, long forgotten. But these review teams were exactly one of the things I worked on. And it's frustrating to hear, here we are 15 years on, that you see somebody being arrested 4 times and nothing happens. Maybe the cases were so weak that nothing could happen. But I doubt the police feel that way. That's my sense from talking to officers. They get frustrated because they make these arrests and the person's right back out in a couple hours. I personally have had that experience here recently, not domestic violence, but fact remains, just like, wait a minute, what? So at some point, the other stuff is great, but maybe going to the legislature and bumping up some of these penalties to make it hurt. Because this person, I'm guessing, was out almost immediately, back doing like it never even happened, until something tragic happens. And that's very frustrating, and it undermines confidence in everything else we do up here. And, you know, going to the Justice Department and asking them for help, they're not going to help you with this. They're not going to help you hire officers. They're not going to lower response times. They're not going to do anything to help an actual citizen. So don't look for them for help. It ain't coming. Lord helps those who help themselves. And so I would strongly suggest, if our lobbying team is listening, and we're listening, because we could go lobby the legislature too. I've already done it, so I feel like on this issue, I've spoken my piece. There's plenty of video and so forth from back in the day to say that. But I do think if I was watching at home, I think the question in my head would be like, what the hell? Why were they still out and allowed to keep doing this? I don't want to speak for the officers, but I bet some of them in the room are thinking that same thing. We did what we could. We kept going out there. I think O.J. Simpson, who might be the most famous, sadly, domestic violence person in history, I think he had 7 calls to his house before tragedy, like final tragedy struck. Nobody wants to replicate that, but here we are with 5. I just wanted to say my piece. I doubt it's going to change anything, but we have lost our focus on what's important and what we should be doing here, I feel. And we need more officers, not less. And for those who heard that the community maybe doesn't have confidence in you, that ain't me saying it. So I do have confidence, but I understand these are extremely tough calls. I have police officers in my family, and I know there's some of the calls that nobody wants to catch, but it's also, sadly, I don't mean this lightly, it is a big book of police business. And I'm guessing one of the more likely things that are going to end in something horrible happening to defenseless female or kids. So we need to up our game. One way to do that is to get the perpetrators out of the house and off the street where they can't just go back, even if the victim wants them to come back. Because what we're doing doesn't make a lot of sense. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councilman Waring makes a really good point. From a standpoint of clarification, Kevin or Ed for that matter, The case that you highlighted, the person was arrested 4 or 5 times prior to and such, doesn't mean that they weren't given a citation or anything like that. Can you tell us if they were booked into jail each of those times? Or what history on those arrests can you give us?
Well, I can tell you that he was arrested and booked into jail, and at least one of the cases went to Veterans Court where it was adjudicated, fully adjudicated. Not all of the arrests were directly related to domestic violence. There was a hit and run arrest in there. If there's a theme that ties them together, it's substance abuse. This person had a history of using over-the-counter medications to an extreme and drinking alcohol heavily. Hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you very much. And Councilman Waring had a follow-up, I believe.
Okay, so it sounds like one of these doesn't make it better if it was 3 arrests for domestic violence. That's still terrible. I will say, anybody reading your chart would assume all 4 were related to domestic violence, I think, unless you specifically highlighted that. I don't remember you doing it. But regardless, this is somebody repeat offender, but you hit on something, that's substance abuse, which has become, I'm sorry, a kind of a catch-all excuse for all kinds of egregious behaviors, whether it's going to the bathroom right outside City Hall in full view of the public or whatever. At some point, I don't think, if the courts are looking at that as, well, substance abuse, yeah, you know what? That's not going to make me feel better when you come back and say, oh yeah, now he killed her. That shouldn't fly. Nothing will get me more ramped up when I hear like, okay, well, so we're going to send them to treatment. They get right back out. They go right back to the behavior they were doing before. That's not acceptable. I don't think it's acceptable about large swaths of the public. They just don't come down to meetings and say anything, unfortunately. They've got other things to do. But I don't think you were saying it that way, but that should never be an excuse for egregious behavior. I mean, I worked a lot on the drunk driving issues too when I was in the legislature, some of the bills that are still in effect. You know, fatalities plummeted. Why? People said it was unfair to punish, I guess, the drunk driver. Well, you know what's really unfair? You're just driving down the street trying to get home from work and you get run over by a drunk driver. That's really unfair. It's life-altering, it's horrible, and this falls in that same category. So I don't think you meant it that way, but that is, if courts are acting that way, which I believe them to be, that's nuts. So thank you.
Thank you. Councilwoman Guardado.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to express my support for the formation and ongoing work of domestic violence fatality review team. As someone that grew up around domestic violence, I know how important this is and how great it is to be able to have these type of services for our constituents. As we only get the reports, but what happens inside these homes, and as people are getting brave enough to be able to report what happens inside their homes is not easy. So making sure that we have the right protocols, that we have the right programs. I love everything that we've put in here of the protocols that we're going to put in place, because I think it's not as simple as picking up the phone and making that phone call. I think, making sure that we can, as we are going into these calls, that we can keep that in mind and seeing all the different things that we are going to put in place to making sure that we support these families. What I don't see as much in here though is the support for the children as well. Like what are services that we can also put together for the children that are going through this, and the type of, then I know I'm taking this a little bit, a step a little bit forward, another step on how do we then also work with the schools as well in a very confidential way that can also give some support to a lot of these children, because I just don't want us to, yes, do I want these people to be arrested and be locked up? Absolutely. But I think we also need to make sure that we have those services for the victim, and then also for the children that are experiencing this as well, and hoping that you guys can come, when you guys come back and present, I think you guys said in June, is making sure that we also have some protocols for the children as well. But other than that, I'm very supportive of this. I want to see us implement this and making sure that we continue to do the good work that we're doing. So I just want to thank everyone here. I want to thank our Deputy City Manager Gina Montes, Human Services Department, the Phoenix Police Department, our co-chairs, and the whole Domestic Violence Fatality Review Team for prioritizing this initiative and working collaboratively towards meaningful solutions. And you guys don't have an easy job, and anything that my office can do to continue to support you guys, let us know. And thank you guys so much.
Councilwoman O'Brien.
Thank you, Chairman. At the beginning of the report, you talk about the domestic violence statistics from 2023. And while I appreciate getting these numbers and that we arrested, approximately 25%, it looks like, based on the number of calls, what I'm curious about is the next step. How many were actually prosecuted? And do you look at those statistics as well?
Thank you, Councilwoman O'Brien. We do when we need to, but it's not something that's automatic, because we would have to, that's 9,000 cases that we would have to look through. Most of them are getting prosecuted. I know that for a fact. I don't know the exact number. I know most of them are getting prosecuted to some extent, either misdemeanor or felony. But that is one thing that we can start doing, is trying to follow up on some of these to see where they actually land.
So do our systems not have that in them as a part of the tracking system to know that if we forward them for prosecution, do we not get feedback from whether it's the county? I'm assuming it's going to the county attorney because of the level of these arrests. Do we not get that feedback loop?
We know when they've been sent to the county attorney's office or even the city attorney's office, and we get a reply as to what happened afterwards. Our system does not currently, we're not able to track what happened with the county attorney's office in our system. We would have to go through each report to see what happened.
Okay, so I'm going to put on the record that I think that is a failure on our part for our system. Our system, we need to know and be able to say, I mean, to me, that is just as simple as these numbers. We should be able to say how many got prosecuted. Like Councilman Waring and other council members, I get to talk to community members and police officers about a multitude of issues, and it is a common complaint that we're arresting them, they're back out on the street, we don't know what happened. So if we can't track that in our system so that we can tell our citizens the good work we are doing, or if there's a problem with the work we're doing and we need to adjust that, we need to be able to identify that as well. So I'd like our system to track what happens. And
I'm sorry. And then to clarify, we can find out. It's just not an automatic component that we have right now. However, this issue, as well as the issue of the strangulation of separating that, we're working with the new vendor, the Premier One, to try to incorporate that into the new system that will go into effect later on this year. So that may take a little bit of time, but we are working with the vendor to incorporate that into the system.
And I'm glad to hear that you're working on that and that the new system could incorporate it. I know we track certain things, but in a world where so much is done based on data, I do get concerned that we're not tracking some important data pieces, and this is an important one. It's great if we've arrested somebody, but that's just part of it. Arresting somebody doesn't separate them from the situation long-term if they've really committed that crime. And we need to know that information to know if we need to make adjustments. Additionally, I would like to understand a little bit more about the difference between what happens with the crisis response team and the behavioral health team, that we would be looking at changing those policies.
Thank you, Councilwoman O'Brien, Chair, Council members. The answer to that question would be best answered by Fire, who is responsible for developing.
Yeah, and Mr. Chair, members of the subcommittee, again, I think that conversation can be had during our next presentation, and we can talk a little bit about the expectations for the crisis response teams related both to their response times, but as well as the difference between the BHU units and the crisis response units. And I will just note that this incident occurred at a time when we didn't have the level of resources in the behavioral health units up and running that we have today. So it's a little bit different landscape, but we're in a much better position today. And I think DC Ernst, the administrator over CAP, will be able to explain to you some of the things that have been put into place, as well as what the protocols are for each type of unit and what their purposes are.
Okay, and that's fine. I'm happy to have that question answered in the next item. Sorry, I just have a couple more, Chair. We talk about I know the police department has their system. Kevin, you talked about your system. So these are two separate systems that track information related to the same cases. Do your systems interface and talk to each other, or are they wholly separate systems?
Chairman Robinson, members of the committee, that they are separate systems. And the reason for that is that the work of the Family Advocacy Center and Victim Services is confidential by state statute. And so that information in there isn't shared with even outside city agencies without the client's written permission.
So in your system, you're not tracking information that is relevant to the police department's case?
Correct.
And vice versa?
Correct. We're focused on the welfare, well-being of the client and their recovery from trauma, and not the criminal case. We don't assist in the criminal case or fact-finding in that way.
Okay, and how long does a case stay open in the Human Services?
Chairman Robinson, members of the committee, the case is open until it needs to be closed. There's no timeline for that.
Okay, what defines closure?
Closure is when the client indicates that they have no further, they need no further services, or sometimes they've relocated and we connect them with another service provider, or we've referred them to longer term care.
Okay. Councilwoman O'Brien, I would like to also add to that, as part of recommendation number 6, the Human Services Department has implemented updated protocols to continue to follow up with clients so that we are able to meet them where they are at. So if at one time they say that they need no more services, it could be just a matter of time in which they do. So we have updated so that we will follow up with them, touch base with them once again to see if we could offer any additional services, or if we could provide others outside of the victim, if there's children involved. So for instance, with this recommendation, we have also established a formal process with the Arizona Child and Adolescent Survivor Initiative to be able to support children if they've been involved. And at the Family Advocacy Center regarding children, we also have child help. So with that timeline, we, as Deputy Human Services Director Kevin Mattingly stated, it is based on what the client states, but we allow that flexibility because we understand the time frame and the processing of trauma for an individual and or their family.
Thank you for that additional
Councilwoman, may I add something to that? We don't have an electronic version where we work together with our systems. However, the human component of it, our domestic violence unit and the victims advocates work on the same floor, and they are intrinsically combined. They work together extremely well, and they go back and forth to talk about cases with each other, which does help with the communication of what they're seeing and what we're seeing on our side. So although electronically it isn't, the actual face-to-face component is extremely important.
Thank you for explaining that, Chief. That is important to me. I just want to make sure the data is also important, but the human factor is, of course, the utmost importance. And I appreciate the additional explanation on 6 because it just wasn't jiving for me. And that is my concern, is that ultimately we're helping these people until, and hopefully helping them get out of the situation. Your recommendation number 3 about the required medical follow-up, who pays for that? If they come to the advocacy center to see a doctor because they don't have their own?
Yes, Chairman Robinson, Councilmember O'Brien, the Maricopa County Attorney's Office funds the forensic nurse examiners that are at the Family Advocacy Center. And so a client that's seen there receives no bill, the county pays the bill, takes care of Honor Health on that.
Okay. I appreciate you answering my questions, and I do hope that when we get an update on this, that we can have some of that additional information so we can know the additional good work you're doing. I would also add that if we can know how many folks you are actually helping to leave their situations, and whatever that looks like, whatever leave looks like for the clients, I think that's another important data point to understand. Thank you.
Councilman Waring.
Thank you. So somebody sent me this. If this is the right person, they had a DUI in 2008, a hit and run citation in March of 21, indecent exposures in June of 21 and November of 21, domestic violence assault in December of 21, then the tragedy in May of 22, scheduled to be out on probation next year. This is what makes our citizens think, what the hell are you guys doing? I don't mean you guys specifically, all of us. I'm talking about me too, like all of us. At some point, do you want this to be your neighbor? And if you've ever said the words, oh, we shouldn't have mandatory sentences, we should reduce sentences, this is a walking crime wave. Nobody wants their kids to be subject to an indecent exposure. Nobody wants to obviously have screaming next to their house and so forth. Not to mention the victims were actually living in the house. There's a lot of collateral damage when you have somebody who's just walking around in a crime wave. If they're a veteran, I respect their service. Again, just like the substance abuse, we just can't have you acting like this. I shouldn't have to explain this to an adult, or really even a kid. Even the kids know, like when Oregon got rid of like drug laws, oh, now they're trying to undo that. Who knew it would go wrong? Well, probably a lot of 10-year-olds probably knew that, but hey, I'm just one guy. That's why they've been illegal for 100 years. It is kind of shocking. I don't know how I'd explain this to a constituent. We've had our share of horrible domestic fatalities in Phoenix, including in District 2. I think the worst one that we've had in Phoenix was 2 streets down from my old house at, I think it was on Anderson. I think it was 6 fatalities, and that was a domestic, I believe. Anderson is just north of Bell at 44th Street, probably about maybe 10 years ago. I had moved by then, but knew that neighborhood well. It can happen anywhere, but with this, what are we going to tell people? If this person gets out and does something terrible and hurts somebody, are we going to say, oh, didn't see that coming? Can't believe that happened, totally out of the blue? No. Up the penalties. Have judges make it stick. Hire more police officers to make the arrests. Don't wait for 5, 6, 7 arrests. It's madness. Betty raised a point about children. So I got involved in this 25 years ago. I worked for John McCain. They asked him to be on an anti-domestic violence group, for lack of a better term. I think it was called the Men's Anti-Violence Network. I think that was it. He couldn't. I worked for him, so obviously he was in DC, so I served on the committee. They had a commercial, just broke my heart, because whatever this person's doing, my childhood was the exact opposite. So I hadn't really focused on this until they produced a commercial, the group did, of a young boy sitting at the top of the stairs, listening to the dad beat up the mom. God, that cut me to the quick. I can still picture that commercial. Didn't have money to run it a lot, but it was out there. It was a public service. Betty's right. The more this person is in that house with those kids, the more likely, particularly the male kids, are going to grow up doing the same damn thing. That doesn't give them an excuse, I might add. We just can't have it. We are tolerating stuff we never should be tolerating. And as you can tell by my tone, it aggravates me. So I do wish we'd make this a focus, because there's a lot of this out there, and we've had, you can Google it, there have been doors that I have knocked on campaigning who later, I think pretty much it's always been the male killing the female. Obviously just had it with the former county attorney recently. I don't know if anybody's read the New Times article about that. I cannot believe I'm actually giving advertising to the New Times. The story is horrific. And you just wonder what happened to those kids. And it just breaks your heart. And we're in a position we can do something about it. But instead, we're talking about reducing sentences and the unfairness of it all. And if we just had more arts classes and drug treatment, and that's nuts. That's not going to get it done. I'm not saying those things can't have their place, but that's not the elixir. Taking the person out of the situation is the answer, for sure. Thank you.
No problem. Does anyone have any more additional questions for the panelists? I want to echo what Councilwoman Guardado said with regard to thanking everyone involved in this. It is a great deal of work. It's tough work. We really appreciate everything that's going into it. And at the end of the meeting, we talk about future agenda items. Lori, there's a couple things I want to bring up that I think will help to answer some of the issues that came up today. But thank you to our panelists. Really appreciate everything you had to say. Oh, I'm sorry. I knew there was something else I wanted to do. Before just that, if I can ask Deputy City Manager Ginger Spencer to come down and clarify just a couple of issues for us, and then we'll segue right into the fire department presentation. So you guys, thank you very much. We'll have Ginger come down, clarify a couple of things, and segue into the fire department. So coming to the table now, as I just stated, was Deputy City Manager Ginger Spencer, Fire Assistant Chief Ray Ochoa, and the Community Assistance Program Administrator DC Ernst. Thank you.
Chairman Robinson and members of the subcommittee, thank you for allowing us to come today to present on the Community Assistance Program, and then also allowing me an opportunity just to address some of the questions and concerns that were brought up in the last presentation. So I am a former FAC director for the city of Phoenix, and basically was working this issue about the same time Councilman Waring was, but we both had different hats on at that time. And actually, under my leadership as the FAC director, that's when we published the first fatality review report. So a lot of history there. What I'd like to say is that we understand the importance of balancing holding our abusers accountable, making sure that we have resources for our law enforcement to respond, as well as making sure that we are protecting the victims. And not only the women and men who may be experiencing this victimization, but also the children who are witnessing it. In regards to the CRT, crisis response teams, and the behavioral health teams, working with our Family Advocacy Center, what I'd like to say is from a crisis response team, we have been working with the FAC since the late 1990s. And so that program has been in place and it's long established. And so DC in her presentation will talk specifically about response team, the response times. I think what I'm hearing though in the recommendation that came from the FAC and the fatality review team was specifically protocols dealing with when calls are canceled. And so we will work together to develop those, establish those protocols and make things more clear of when it's canceled, right? The CRT team is called out by police or fire, they respond, but then also too, who's making that call to cancel it and why. And then also too, specifying when a CRT team is called out to respond versus when a behavioral health team is called out to respond. So I do want you to know there are existing protocols in place, but that is what we need to look at, is when those calls are canceled. And then also, as our Assistant City Manager, Lori Bays, expressed as well, is, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here, is on the behavioral health teams. That is newly established, and that was at the direction of mayor and council. And so our behavioral health teams have been in place in the last 3 years, and DC will talk about what we're doing in those efforts. So lastly, what I'd like to say is I want you to know, mayor and council, that we do have an internal team in place. We have a multidisciplinary team in place that is chaired by Deputy City Manager Gina Montes and myself. That includes fire, police, human services department, as well as several city departments. And we're looking at the coordination of how we work together in dealing with these mental health calls. And if that's okay, if you don't have any questions for me, or if you do, I'll answer them, but also transition it for our presentation.
Deputy City Managers, Spencer, thank you very much. Councilwoman Guardado has a question.
Yeah, I just have a question. So I just think that as we're looking at the protocols, and like I said earlier, you know, when someone makes a call, I don't think it's easy to make that call. I think it's a lot easier to cancel it than to make it. So I still think that we should still send a team out there just to doing even just a wellness check. I think it's important for us to still do that, because we just don't know exactly what's happening in that home as people are making those phone calls. And and then especially if the response times, if we're still in a place where response times are not as good as we would want them to be, I still think that it's important for us to send out a team out there, just to check on the family and making sure that there's anything that they need. Because I think as these situations are happening, they change very dramatically every few minutes. So I think that as part of the protocols, even if the calls are canceled, I still think that we should send a team out there just to do a wellness check. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll move on with the presentation. Chief Ochoa.
Thank you. Chair Robinson's subcommittee members, first, Happy New Year. It's an honor to be back in front of you to give you an update on what we are doing to move forward to meet our goal of 10 crisis response teams and 9 behavioral health teams, as well as to ensure that there's 24/7 coverage from a BHU dispatcher. So in this presentation, I'll talk about our recruitment efforts, where we are currently as far as staffing. We'll review the stats on transferred calls from police communications, updates on our behavioral health response, crisis response teams responses, as well as our next steps. It was an honor for us to work with our city and fire HR, as well as the mobile career unit, to host a hiring event in November of 2024. Prior to that recruitment, prior to that event, we did recruit for the positions that we were hiring for, which were our specialist positions and our supervisor positions. That allowed us to pre-plan some of the interviews, but on that date, we also were accepting walk-ins. As a result, we have multiple individuals currently in the background process. We anticipate onboarding those candidates within the month. And I'll provide more details regarding how those additional employees will impact our operations. The next 3 slides are the same slides that you've seen previously. We did not update the percentage as we have not onboarded those individuals. They haven't accepted the final offers, so I wanted to keep this information the same. However, If we're able to onboard all the individuals that we offered tentative jobs to, in the future, we hope to bring forth that number of people will bring us to 80% of our filled positions as we continue to recruit and onboard additional individuals. Again, with this recruitment, if every person accepts the position, we will be able to meet the March 31st deadline to have the behavioral health supervisors in place and actively accepting calls 24/7. So again, for our full-time positions, we're still at 68%, and for our part-time positions, we are at 52%. We remain at 5 behavioral health units that are available 7 days a week, on average 23.5 hours a day. We have the 6 crisis response teams that are available 7 days a week. 5 of those days are available 24 hours, and 2 of those days they're up 22 hours. And again, with the recruitment or with the hiring and onboarding of our new recruits, we anticipate that we will be at 24-hour coverage, both for the behavioral health units as well as the crisis response units. Again, our goal is by the end of March for that as well. So as I said earlier, our target and our goal is to have the 9 behavioral health units. So right now we're at 55% of that target. We have 4 remaining units. We anticipate being able to fill all of those positions and have the total 9 units in service by the first quarter of 2026. For the crisis response units, we're at again, 60% of our target of 10 units, and we anticipate that those additional units will be filled upon fully establishing our BHU staff. For our BHU dispatchers, currently we have staff in the dispatch accepting calls from Phoenix Police from Sunday through Tuesday from 10 a.m. Excuse me, I'm sorry. This is actually, can you give me just 1 minute while I collect my thoughts? I apologize. So we have dispatchers in our room Sunday through Tuesday from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. taking calls from PD dispatch. On Wednesdays through Saturdays, we actually have 24/7 coverage. And again, we do anticipate having that 24/7 coverage by March 31st, 2025. As we continue to collaborate with our police communications to help identify the types of calls that can be transferred over to us, in July of 2024, we had one of our supervisors become established within police communications Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. That was for 24 hours a week. We are actually increasing that to 32 hours a week. And as we continue to build our program, we will look to work with communications to continue to extend the hours that we have a supervisor in that communications division. This slide represents the total number of calls transferred from PD to a BHU supervisor. We continue to see that there is an increase of 172% increase in the first 11 months when you compare 2023 to 2024. And we are continuing, like I said, working with communications to identify calls. This next slide, you've seen this before, represents where our teams are currently located, as well as we anticipate putting additional BHU teams in the future. For our BHU calls for service, which are actually the teams responding out to calls, you'll notice that these numbers exceed the number of calls that are transferred from PD communications. We've continued to see an increase, again, over the past 11 months in comparison to 2023. There has been a 136% increase. Of the calls transferred, represent approximately 47% of the overall call volume or calls for service that we're experiencing. The other way that our teams get dispatched is through fire. They could self-dispatch if they're out in the field and they see someone who they believe might benefit from their services. They can stop and assist those individuals as well. This represents where our CR units are currently established. And again, you've seen this before, and we are still looking to the future to utilize the GEO bond to get our teams into what will be Old Station 7, Old Station 13, and Old Station 15. The teams that are working there probably don't appreciate me calling them that right now. This slide represents the CR calls for service. And again, we have seen an increase between 2023 and 2024 of 13% of the total number of calls that our CR units are also responding to. We are receiving national recognition through our relationship with Harvard Kennedy's Government Performance Lab. They recently completed a case study where they looked at embedding behavioral health professionals in the 911 centers and approaches to alternative response. We were one of 2 cities that were identified in this particular publication. If you're interested, the website is there, as well as a QR code will take you to that report. So I wanted to give you a little information on some of the work that our teams are doing. I'm going to provide 3 different success stories. The BHU team was dispatched in lieu of police on an incident involving an individual who had recently relocated to Phoenix and was not receiving the services that they needed to address their mental health issues. This resulted in that individual having signs and symptoms of difficulty breathing and essentially what a lot of people would consider anxiety. The BH team completed an assessment of the individual's needs and determined that that individual would best be served by receiving transport to a facility to be assessed at a facility to ensure that they were able to get the medications that they did not have. The team worked with that individual while they were transporting them to the facility to develop a short-term and long-term plan so that when they were released from the facility, that individual had a plan in place moving forward. A CR team was dispatched to assist a family who was in the need of some emergency shelter. The family included parents and a young child. Our CR team reached out to multiple different community partners, which resulted in one of those agencies being able to place the family in a hotel, which they would then be followed up with by that community partner to provide longer-term resources for that family. And then my final success story is that PD Communications transferred a call, again, for a family without sending PD, so it was a singular response for us. The family was actually outside of business. They had come into town to pick up a family member who was having mental health issues. And again, they weren't successful in getting those mental health issues addressed here, so they wanted to take their loved one back home. In order to do that, the individual with the mental health diagnosis had to give up some possessions. And that was really challenging for this individual. So they were sitting outside an agency where they were going to donate the belongings. And our team was able to talk to the individual, calm that individual down, de-escalate them. The end result was that that individual was able to donate the items that needed to be donated and get onto a plane and return home. And we did receive a call from the father later that day thanking us for the assistance in getting their loved one on the plane to get them home for the services needed. Our continuing efforts, we anticipate that we will be recruiting again for our specialist position this month, completing interviews in February. We will continue to work with our HR departments to ensure that that continues until all of our behavioral health teams and CR teams are filled. With the hiring, we anticipate that we will be increasing the total number of units in our next hiring round, while this last round from November will stabilize what we currently have in place. And we will continue to work with police to increase the number of calls that can be identified for us to respond to in lieu of police or fire. And as we continue to onboard new staff and basically double and triple what we have historically had as staff, we continue to look for ways to support our team members as they go out and do this work. The picture on the bottom of this slide represents a Thanksgiving meal that we all shared together to continue to build our team. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Any questions? Councilwoman O'Brien.
Sorry. Thank you for all the efforts to increase the hiring, and I look forward to your next report that reflects that. I want to talk a little bit about incorporating the person into our 911 dispatch, because I think that seems to be really critical. And I commend you. You've increased it from 24 to 32, but you know what I'm going to ask next is how do we get more? Sorry, today's the day of more. So what's the plan to increase that to where it could be 24/7?
Chair Robinson, Councilwoman O'Brien, thank you for the question. It's a matter of us continuing to hire to have the personnel to fit those shifts. So we are working with PD Communications to continue increasing our presence on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And then we are still in talks about how do we increase that and potentially add more days of the week.
Okay, so do you think you'll have an update next time we hear from you all on what that plan might look like?
Chair, Councilwoman, yes, we will.
Okay, thank you.
Councilwoman Guardado.
Thank you. Well, again, thank you guys so much for all of your hard work and everything that you guys have been doing. I know that, it was an urgent need to get this department up and running. So thank you, Ginger. Thank you, Lori. Thank you, Chief. Thank you, everyone, for all of your hard work. And, I commend you on your recruitment and being able to staff up. But I have a different question. What are we gonna do to retain? What are the practices that we're gonna put in place to making sure that we're also taking care of the people that we have hired? I know that when I first came into office, we were having a lot of issues with our 911 operators, where we were losing a lot of them, not because they didn't love the job, but because there were things that were missing to making sure that we were also able to go the extra mile to be able to take care of them as they were taking on all of these phone calls. What are some things that we have in place already or that we can put in place to make sure that we are also taking care of the people that are doing this incredible work, but it's also incredibly hard?
Chair, Councilwoman, thank you so much for the question. So we have already put into place a committee that is looking at how do we support our individuals. In fact, today we're having a pizza party. But we also have some things in place specifically because the calls that they go on are intense and involve high emotions. We have things in place where they can identify if that call was high stress for them, and we have protocols in place for when a supervisor will contact them, talk about debriefing, as well as we have our EAP program. The other critical thing that I think will help is we did hire a curriculum coordinator, and we are looking at continuing education opportunities for individuals and ways that we can support them and mentor them so that they can continue to grow in our program, and essentially, if they would like to take over my position when I'm ready to retire.
That's always important. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for that.
Okay, I want to thank everybody for the presentation, exceptional presentation. And actually, the entire community assistance program reminds me, or it's more emblematic of what used to be written on the fire trucks or all fire equipment, our family helping yours. And never more so than through this program. So we thank you for the presentation. Thank you very much. Okay, items 5 and 6 are for information only. Do any of my colleagues have any questions about the Phoenix Fire Department staffing and response time? Councilman Waring.
Like you expected that. No, I don't know. Thanks. Yes, I would like to talk about this. Is anybody here to talk about it?
We have Chief Duran come down to the table, Mr. Chair, if that's okay with you. And Executive Assistant Chief Grace.
So thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it. I'll start with a question. I hope I know the answer. So last time, Chief, you went through, I think it was 4 criteria that kind of affect response times. The only one, as I recall, that seemed pertinent in District 2 was the distance traveled. So we don't have high call volumes. The call volumes in District 2 are dramatically lower than really every other district, but they're 2.5 times lower than District 8. They're half of what's in District 7, et cetera, and lower than everything else, more than half in District 4. So are we starting with that baseline? Distance traveled is the problem with response times in District 2. Is that a fair statement? Okay, you're nodding yes. Excellent. But before we get to that, I did ask specifically last time, the call volumes I just mentioned in the other districts. So we do redistricting here in the city. So we actually count the number, just saying this for people at home, I know you guys already know. We actually have very recently counted and done a census of how many people live in Phoenix, and then we break up the districts so they're all the equal size. So we were all at like 201,000 in each of the 8 districts that we represent. So they took the 1.6, 1.7 million Phoenicians, they divided it by 8, and then we had to drive boundaries kind of around that. So we all had the same number of people, but there are 2.5 times more calls for service, and we'll just use District 8 as an example, but I highlighted that they're dramatically higher in some of these other districts too. My question was why, and I asked, do you guys know these calls are going out? Are they heart attacks? It would seem unlikely to me that District 8 had 20,000 more fires than District 2. If that's your answer, that would surprise me. Or that we're so much healthier in District 2 that District 8 had 20,000 more heart attacks. Also seems unlikely. So do you have the answer to my question, Mr. Chair, of what accounts for this enormous disparity in the use of this precious life-saving resource?
Thank you, Chairman Robinson and committee for your questions and the excellent direction and feedback and discussion from our last meeting. Certainly, as you stated, one of the big factors with District 2 is it is much bigger, a lot more road miles associated with response times. Specific to the discrepancy between the number of calls in specific council districts, understanding that the populations are the same, I am extremely interested in partnering with some research institutions to come up with a very clear understanding of that. Certainly, there are areas within the community that have higher population densities and folks within the community that activate the 911 system more frequently, but to really study it with some partners is extremely important to me. As a matter of fact, I reached out to the Maricopa County Department of Public Health to see if they could help with studying specifically the factors associated.
Okay, Mr. Chair, thank you. At least that's something. So I hope we can get that started right away, because this is, and I'm not trying to make light isn't the right word, but I'm not trying to say anything that should be misinterpreted as frivolous, but this is a product that taxpayers are purchasing. Ultimately, that's what it is. They pay taxes. That's why governments were set up, police and fire, and I think we've lost sight of some of that, as I mentioned earlier in a different item. But the people in District 2, if this was a product that you went to the store and bought on the shelf, you would go buy it from a different provider. If it was a streaming service, you'd go buy it from a different provider. Because if you're in District 2, it buffers a lot and it doesn't have nearly as many movies as some other streaming service in some other part of town. You'd be mad, you'd go shop for something else. Because response times is a critical component of this, and our response times are horrible. You can take out density or whatever. The people in District 2 are paying for this, and they would probably want to know if my response times are lower, and unless we build a new station, they are almost bound to be lower, or excuse me, higher response times, worse response times, I guess is really how to frame it. They might want to know how come these other folks in a different part of town are getting such better service, because they are. Numbers are right here. They're using more of it, and it's getting to them quicker. So some of us in District 2 are going to die so that they can use the service a lot more and be saved more because the response is a lot quicker. I'm not saying it's your fault. I think you're not, hopefully not taking it that way. But that is a question that someone might ask. I'm asking it. 10 years ago, we went through this exercise along the 17, and the result, we weren't going to build a fire station 55. but I got involved and Thelda Williams got involved. She was the councilwoman in the district right across the street on I-17, and we got District Station 55 built, and so that was great, about a year and a half, and I really appreciated that. Appreciation to Chief Kalkbrenner, my neighbor, for getting that done. But now I look at the map that you guys provided of the stations. I already knew it, but now I've got it in front of me. I mean, there is a big hole, a donut hole, basically in District 2, and the state, unlike the police who drive around, different problem when you have a lot of area, but unless we plop a station right in the middle, I don't know that these numbers are going to change. So at least owe an explanation to people who live in District 2 of what's going on here. So that's a point I wanted to make. Scottsdale is building a station at Hayden and Mayo. I don't know how quickly it'll be built, but they're building one. And Chief, you had talked last time about some changes in staffing and so forth up in the northwest corner of my district. But neither one of those is going to address distance. They're still a long way away. So you talked about that, particularly the northwest corner. You didn't mention the Scottsdale facility. But that's not really going to help the people that we're talking about who are in the middle of District 2. I voted against the bond. And Chief, you and I had discussed this before the bond. I voted against the bond. I think it was an 8-1 vote, if memory serves. I might have voted for the bond, but I specifically said I wasn't voting for the bond because there weren't enough fire stations. Even specifically that there should be one in District 2. The stuff that was in there, a lot of it was great, but I thought it should be more public safety focused. The focus was on future bonds. Like, well, that presumes a lot about future councils. The names of whose members would be voting to put this on the ballot, we don't even know. And voters, 1.7 million of them, or however many million voters, who knows if they're going to vote for it or not. So I didn't think, no offense, that was a compelling answer because there's a lot of unknowns there, considering we hadn't had a bond pass at that point in 18 years, or 16 years. So I don't know that we can count on a new station. I know we've talked about redeploying some of the ambulance stuff, so that hopefully will help. But it is hard to explain like what we're doing here when we are building new stations elsewhere that already have lower response times. I get that they have more calls for service, so I understand that component of it, but I don't feel that's fair to the district I represent. I talked about the Scottsdale station. That's not really gonna necessarily help. It might alleviate some if there's like several things going on at the same time, or if there's some huge fire, because you had talked about that last time. You know, if there's some big incident, then having other stations somewhere around, at least you're gonna get something, but it's still gonna be late. You know, ABC did a story, which I thought was a good story about this subject. I didn't speak to them because I didn't feel I needed to. I felt like, frankly, I had said what I wanted to say at the last meeting. I was a little surprised that it said the Phoenix Fire Department declined comment. This isn't a police incident where it might go to court or something. I do think now or sometime in the future, an explanation of this, and at least what we're doing with the ambulance to try to alleviate it, because I don't know how many people watch these meetings. Maybe it's 3, maybe it's 5, I don't know, but you know, how many people in District 2 actually watch this? I don't know, but probably more watch some of the news stations and so forth. So I do think a response would be in order. An explanation, as I said, about why the use is so dramatically higher, because that's inexplicable without some man-made or decision-making components. It just can't be, you know, too much red meat is being eaten in a different part of the city, so more people are having heart attacks, and there's 20,000, more than double. I mean, that doesn't make any logical sense. I understand that it's extremely expensive to build these stations if you don't have property. Station 55, you did have the property, and if I remember correctly, had the plans. So I did appreciate Fire's rapid response, and again, I'm saying 10 years ago, I think it was about that. Getting people out and deployed temporarily, I believe it was at a hotel. They were staging, check me if I'm wrong, but I think that's right, you're nodding, so I think my memory is correct. That things had gotten really out of hand response time-wise. It was brought to my attention by firefighters, and so and about a year and a half, you had a station, but you had a response and more firefighters up there within a couple weeks. So again, relation to the bond, the union was in my office one day and some of the union members were like, you didn't vote for the bond. I'm like, well, I explained, I specifically spoke about this with leadership that one more fire stations. That was the ask. And I didn't think that was unreasonable, but I do get, it's not the easiest lift up there. You don't see a ton of development either because it's really expensive to buy the property if you don't already have it. And there is a lot of state trust land up kind of in the middle that we're talking about. So the houses aren't all together. It's like kind of a big spread between, I guess you'd call it subdivisions. You don't really hear that phrase anymore, but that's what they called it back in the day. So you have kind of a big gap. And I don't know how that works exactly with state land. I know with schools with development, I know Ann always works on that as a former school board member, making sure that there are schools for the people to be living up there. But I certainly hope that somewhere along Tatum, Cave Creek Road, there could be another station at some point, much sooner rather than later. But I understand these things are usually, we did the one in a year and a half. This would be more like maybe a 5-year project or something. That doesn't help the people right now. There's been an ongoing problem. I was, again, grateful. So I'm not trying not to bag on you guys. It's not your fault. You weren't even in leadership then. But, about the turnaround on the one. But it's on the far west side. It's still a long distance to travel. And there's just, until we invent the Star Trek teleporter, that's going to be so forever. So the station in Scottsdale, the station up at Carefree Highway and the 17, that really just can't solve the problem. With police, I wasn't as focused on the stations because they're out in their cars driving around. But it wouldn't be realistic to have you guys driving around in your trucks all day long just waiting for a thing. And particularly with the difference is traveled, you might be driving away from where the action winds up being. So I just want to make those comments. If you guys have any responses, obviously I asked some of these same questions last time, certainly made those comments. I would appreciate, though, if you either put out a statement or say something now or whatever to address this, because I'm not the expert in firefighting. I also don't have the information about why is the usage so high in the other districts. Sounds like you guys don't either. But it is something that at least I feel like we should explain because it is driving life and death decisions in a different part of the city. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair. I appreciate your indulgence.
No worries. Councilwoman Guardado.
Thank you. Chief, those questions were asked before, and I've thought about it as well, right? I'm not the representative in District 8, but District 8 is the district that has the most homeless facilities, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And could we get a breakdown about how many of those calls might come from any of these homeless facilities?
Mr. Chair, members of the subcommittee, Councilwoman Guardado, we can look at that, especially, those that are funded through the city, and we can also identify other facilities through the HMIS system, but that will take some additional research to make sure we have all of the facilities identified and then looking at those in the system, but we can look at that and get that information back to you.
Yeah, I think it's important to get answers to those questions, right? I think that, as I'm looking at these numbers, I could understand why there's a bigger call volume in District 8, right? District 8 has taken the biggest burden of adding more beds, adding more shelters, adding more facilities for folks that are experiencing homelessness. That's where CAS is at as well. So being able to get between District 7 and District 8, I'm not surprised that the numbers look the way they look, given that these are districts that have welcomed in the facilities for our homeless folks. I understand that there should be a fire station in every district. I think, everyone pays taxes, but then at the same time, I can see why I am not surprised why the numbers look like this, but I think it is important to get some of these answers, just so that we can look at, throughout the years, we have concentrated services in South Phoenix, which, a lot of us have mixed emotions about that and why they're only put in one part of town. But I do think that it's important to get answers for this. just so that we can look at, where are these calls coming from? What's happening? I mean, I also know that there's a study out there that I've heard about. I haven't seen it, but I've heard about it. That life expectancy in District 8 is a lot shorter than it is in other parts of the city, just because the lack of quality food, the lack of trees, the lack of, quality of life has been very difficult in that side of town. And I know that all the council members that have represented that area and that represent that area are doing a lot to be able to change that as well. So I think being able to get our hands on a lot of this information, I mean, poverty rates are also incredible in these areas where the numbers are higher. Like I said, access to quality food is very difficult in a lot of these areas. And I know that council members and other people are working to change that. But until that doesn't change, I don't think that these numbers are going to change either. But again, I do agree that I do believe that we should have more bonds. We should have a lot more fire stations. I think everyone deserves to have that. But being able to break down those numbers on the why, I think it's also important. I think that, as we're asking these questions here on the dais, there should be an effort to get answers to these questions, just so that we can, at least at peace and maybe then after that make a plan on how is it that we're going to address, the issues of all the constituents throughout the city. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I may just respond to that briefly. Well, I just want to make sure that the subcommittee understands some of the things that we're working on. So to answer the questions that were posed during the last meeting related to the fire department, we are actually putting together a report which will be presented as part of the packet for the February meeting. That was noted in this month's packet, but it was just a very brief line, so I'm not sure if folks were able to pick up on that. But we are putting that together, so you will have a written report related to the answers to those questions. We are also happy to discuss that information, more publicly if that's the subcommittee's desire. Additionally, we are doing research similar to what Chief Kreis alluded to on what is happening with the call volumes and why those things are occurring. There is a lot of research that substantiates what you just talked about, Councilwoman, related to the social determinants of health and how those play into, response times in effect, but into a lot of things, life expectancy, access to healthcare, healthy food, all of those things play into what happens with a person's health and their life over time. That does play into use of emergency services as well. And so that's a much more complex discussion, but it's also why we want to bring in our public health partners in helping us looking at that data. We have pulled data, which we will share with you, related to the top 10 call types in each district, and it does vary, and it doesn't tell a real clear story just looking at that, which is why we want to dive into it deeper and understand better what's happening in each district, so that we can make better decisions and better strategic decisions going forward. We're also looking at our planning process, and I'll let the chief speak to this, related to future stations, and when we do have additional funds, whether that's through a bond program in the future or something else to build more stations, where are the highest priority places for those stations to go? And there needs to be constant adjustment to that plan and tweaks based on what's happening in each district. And so we also are receiving feedback from you and incorporating that into the planning process related to future stations and where we would be recommending those stations or additional resources to go. You mentioned the additional ambulance units that have been placed into service, Councilman Waring, up in District 2, and those are showing promise and being effective in reducing response times to some degree. The data is still new, and so we want to make sure we collect that a little longer before we, can say definitively what's happening there. But adding additional resources like that is helpful also. Doesn't necessarily have to always be a full station to start off with. We can, do things incrementally. So we are looking at all of those things, and we will be bringing more information back to you related to how we can make impacts across the city, and then specifically in areas of concern like we're discussing today with District 2.
Thank you very much. Councilwoman O'Brien, then Councilman Waring.
Thank you, Chair. Can you just refresh my memory on when the stations that were approved in the bond to replace our smaller, older stations, where they're at in the process, and how soon can we expect to see those rebuilt? Because they will be built bigger and better, which would provide more resources in those areas, which can have a ripple effect on the surrounding stations. So I want to say 7, and I won't remember all the numbers, 15 and 10 maybe, but help me out there.
Certainly. Chairman Robinson, members of the subcommittee, Councilwoman O'Brien, yes. So 4 fire stations are included in this bond here from 2024 to 2029. Our first fire station right now is Fire Station 15, which is located at 43rd Avenue, just south of Camelback. We are working, that station is now into our plans review right now, and moving forward, we will be adding an additional all hazards engine and rescue to that location. So we'll have 2 engines and 2 rescues at that fire station location. That station location runs over about 5,000 calls a year annually, just that one engine company. So it's a very high volume, and we know it will certainly have an impact. Chief Christ did a presentation. Our next station would be Station 7, and Chief Christ did a presentation a couple years back on how Fire Station 7, being one of our busiest fire stations, running almost 6,000 calls at the time. Just this last year, they ran over almost 5,400 calls this past year. If you look at Fire Station 7, about 27% of the time, their calls are being covered by surrounding crews. So that means if they run almost 6,000 calls, you're projecting about 2,000 or so plus calls being covered by the surrounding companies that are responding into that area there. So that's our next fire station. So we are adding, that is going to be going through plans here shortly. We do have land already dedicated for that site just about 4th Street, just south of Dunlap. We'll be adding another engine and another rescue to that fire station, and we're looking at some completion sometime around 2027, mid-year. The next fire station would be Fire Station 13 at 48th Street in Thomas. We are looking to purchase land just across 48th Street there. Same thing, this will be another fire station. We'll be adding another engine and rescue to that station. So we'll have 2 engines, 2 rescues running out of that fire station. Again, Fire Station 13 running over about 5,000 calls a year annually. So this is about assisting in that area. We know we have high call volume, as well as, looking at the welfare of our members, right, and running that type of call. That is not sustainable for our members to run that type of call volume day in and day out on a 24-hour shift, and then be expected to work extra shifts throughout the year there. So that is why those 3 stations are being addressed first in the bond. And then our 4th fire station, being Fire Station 51, will be located at the 303 and 51st Avenue to assist in that area in the development of the TSMC and the tech site that's being coming forward in the future there.
So the first 3 you mentioned, can we anticipate that they would be done by the end of 2027, or is it by the end of 2028?
Excuse me, Chairman Robinson, Councilwoman O'Brien, members of the subcommittee. So Fire Station 7, we're looking at mid-year, about 2027 or so. And then it'll be 1 year after that, Fire Station 13 in 2028, mid-year or so, and then Fire Station 51 being in 2029.
And what about 15? Where does that fall?
Fire Station 15, we're looking, again, it's already going through design right now. We're looking to potentially be 2026, is what I would say, mid-year 2026 for Fire Station 15.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Councilman Waring.
Thank you. So about the ripple effect, when you look at this map, and I didn't mean to be too harsh last time, I hope I wasn't, so apologies if I was, but, it would have to be a pretty big ripple, like a tsunami, for any of what you're talking about here to affect District 2, number 1. But number 2, even if somehow you were able to alleviate the call volume in the already existing stations in District 2, which was discussed last time, the distances traveled are still, even if there were more people in the station, they're still nowhere near some of these houses, which I get, it doesn't show on the map that I've got here, but a lot of this is not developed, but it theoretically will be at some point. That's what caught us With District 55, the response time shot up because all of a sudden there were a lot of apartments, a lot of development, obviously with TSMC along the border that District 2 shares with Ann's District 1. You know, that's going to go up even more. So I get that that's a plan, and I'm sure you guys are basing that on best practices and so forth. But, you know, I'm going to guess that a lot of those best practices are based on stuff that they've been studying in New York for 150 years. Well, this is much different than that, just topography-wise, or however you want to say it, but distance traveled, you know, it's not the same thing. Betty alluded to that about, I think she was referencing District 8, you know, that probably the distances traveled on every one of those calls is probably a lot shorter. Now, I didn't want to speculate. You guys didn't speculate, which I appreciate. You're going to have somebody check. But I am aware that there is a possibility, I'm not saying it's true, that the homeless shelters, and I'm guessing possibly drug overdoses, account for a lot of this difference. Don't know that that's true, not saying it is, but if that in fact is the case, if you had a bond and you were like, well, you know, let's say this last bond, we got to build some more stations down here because the call volume's a lot higher to help the 7,000 homeless who generally congregate in this part of the city, and then there are a lot of overdoses. You know, your bond wouldn't pass, right? I mean, at some point, that wouldn't be sellable. I have said this before about other things. The 7,000 who are definitely, we want to make sure we respond to every call and they get the services, should not be detracting from the services that the rest of the city gets. Doesn't mean our citizens don't get to use parks, because there's needles all over and they find on average a little more than one dead body in a park every month, and people come across that. And then I'm guessing they don't want to go to parks after that experience. I just, at some level, that can't be the driving factor, and I fear that it is. And you can't tell citizens that, who are going to work every day and paying their taxes, your father might die, because, you know, my father lived with me, and I had to call you guys a couple times when I just couldn't get him off the floor anymore with his falls. That actually finally shook him into agreeing to go to a facility. Now he's passed away. But, so I know what that feels like. It didn't affect us. The service was great, and I appreciate it, but very much so. I took, as I alluded to last time, an unnecessary ambulance trip, but my doctor wasn't going to let me leave the doctor's office. He thought I was having a heart attack. Just turned out I was doing too much exercise. What are you going to do? So he was not going to let me leave, or at least drive home, for sure. So I guess I contributed one to the problem of maybe you didn't need to take the ambulance trip. That's not really for you guys to decide, but we should at least tell people, this is what you're paying for, this is what's on your ballot. You're going to get less services, and that's not going to go well as a discussion. That won't be understood by people, because they love their families, presumably, and they're going to be like, what, you know, wait a minute, my mom's going to get less service, she might pass away, because again, it's not your fault. I get the metrics of how some of this came to be. I get that if you built a station where I'm talking about you building one, it would probably be, to your minds, again, it's not the right term, but I think people understand, it'll be less utilized. I don't want to say underutilized, because that implies something I don't mean, but it won't get as much use as one that you might build in District 8. But we might also want to find ways that to get people healthier food or whatever it is that they need, so that they're not calling the ambulance service all the time if it's not necessary. It would be hard to believe that every one of these, the 2.5 times of call volume for the exact same, almost to the number, I think we had to do it for this census, I think it was, or the redistricting, I think it was within a couple hundred or something, that it produces this disparate of results. I think any statistician would say, okay, there's some factor here you guys aren't doing. The heat mitigation, the responses that we talked about, that's something that you guys play into. What did we find? I believe it was heat-related deaths. 89% of them, there was a comorbidity with, I believe it was heroin and fentanyl. The city counted, I think there were less than 1,000. So that was something you could look at every single case. Again, I still want you to go on those calls, but of course, if you reduced drug use, you would free up a lot of ambulance services. So it would really, again, if we looked at this as a product, if we're trying to improve like a company would, finding out what's going on and trying to address some of these other issues would really behoove us. It would make our citizens across the city healthier. So that's really what I'm asking for when it comes right down to it. You know, given the timelines, obviously, if we're talking about, well, we might put a District 2 I'll be gone, but might in the next bond, and then it's going to take a few years to build. You know, we're not talking about, it'd be a decade before a station like I'm talking about would probably be built, maybe a little less, maybe. Probably depends on if you have property or something. But so if you could send more ambulances our way, I just think in basic fairness, I'd appreciate it. If you can stage out of a hotel that's being underutilized, that would be awesome. Something. I said Cactus and Tatum. There is one on Tatum. You know, probably a little further west of that is really, you're nodding your head, so I think you're probably familiar. You know, maybe a little west of that, something, because we may not have the call volumes, but every individual deserves the same respect we're paying to some of the rest of the city, and it's just not reflected in these numbers. And again, I appreciate the work you guys, you know way more about your business than I do. I see this, I got to call attention to it just like I did 10 years ago. So thank you, Mr. Chair, I appreciate it.
Thank you. If you don't have any other comments, there's no more questions from the council members. Thank you very much. Really appreciate your time. So the last item today is a call to the public, and based on the information I have.
Mr. Chair, we actually have a speaker on item number 6.
Oh.
Ms. Ender.
That's right. I apologize. Sorry, Annie.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Happy New Year, Chairman Robinson and committee members. Just wanted to make a few comments about the police department staffing report. Much better. I think the information in there is much clearer, gets to the point, but I think there's still some things missing I just wanted to address. Mostly, again, I think that the executive staff need to look inside and they need to be talking to the officers. Morale is really bad. I get calls from, not just me, other community members that get calls regarding, you know, just folks we work with just want to chat, and there's a lot going on. And I think that contributes to us not being able to hire. I'm really concerned about the fact we've lost really, really good commanders. And I'll say their names. Brian Issett, I miss him so much. We work together so well. We've lost Conley, Chapman, Freudenthal. Why are we losing these really good commanders? Why are we, in 2 years, we've lost, I think let me see the numbers, I'm sorry. So in 2002, we had 175 officers that were hired. 71 of them have terminated. Why do we have that 40% loss? Why do we only have maybe 30 officers on patrol in this city of 1.7 million per shift? I'm not the only one. I feel like a lot of times when I speak, I'm talking to all the community members I work with that go, you know, East Sunny Slope, the Hub, Jeff Spellman's group, VIP Coalition. And we're all very, very concerned about how these numbers are affecting our safety. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Then I have Teresa Hill. Did she actually want to speak? No? Okay. Just turn myself back on.
Questions now.
Yes, Councilwoman O'Brien.
Okay. I have some questions that I'd like included when police report next time. I believe they're due on the next agenda to report on their hiring, retention, and recruitment report. And I'd like included in that report the response times for calls by district, the number of dropped calls, the average number of calls that are holding, and for how long. I'd also like included in our report the retention rate specifically for our new hires from the years 2020 through 2023. And I'd like included what our projected sworn numbers are going to be through June 30, 2027. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. With regard to future agenda items, Lori, if we could, I know next month we have the prosecutor's office as an update there. Based on the discussion we had today on item number 3, I believe it was, could we have the prosecutor's office include a discussion or information about domestic violence cases as they come through their office? A roadmap of what usually happens with them and such. I know a lot of times the sentencing is based on state law and all that stuff. So if they can get into that a little bit, I think we'd greatly appreciate that. And the other issue is, and it also comes from, I think it was item number 3, with regard to, it was item number 3. Some of the recommendations by our June, we put down June as a completion date for several of the recommendations. When we get close to that month, when we get close to June, can we have a report to this body about the progress in each one of those recommendations? Because several of them had June of 2025 completion dates. Just an idea of where they're at with those.
Yes, I have all of those items noted.
All right. That's all I had. Does any other member have any other questions or future agenda items? Okay. Thank you very much. The time is 12:10. This meeting is adjourned.
Our office strives to coordinate and improve citywide efforts to protect people from extreme heat and to create a cooler and safer community.